At 83, Roger Staubach is still remembered as one of the purest and most respected icons in American football history. He wore the Dallas Cowboys jersey throughout his entire NFL career, leading the team to 5 Super Bowls and winning the championship twice, including a Super Bowl MVP title that the whole country once saw as the standard for leadership poise. His name is enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, not just as an outstanding quarterback, but as a model of discipline, composure, and responsibility. Before the NFL, he won the Heisman Trophy at the Naval Academy, becoming a rare pride of college football tied to the military, where victory was never separate from duty. On the field, Staubach was famous for his ice-cold comebacks, those decisive moments in silence where he didn't need to celebrate. He just bowed his head and walked back to the sideline, as if winning was a duty, not personal glory. After leaving the game, he continued to succeed in business, building another solid and low-key career, becoming a rare proof of a life where achievements don't stop when the stadium lights go out. To the American public, Roger Staubach is the definition of doing everything right, a complete career, an untarnished honor, a legend without scandal, without noise, without needing to defend his image. But behind that perfect picture of achievement, another story quietly exists, one quieter, heavier, and rarely told. When the applause has faded into memory, what remains with Roger Staubach is not the honors but a body that has paid the full price for greatness. Those old hits didn't vanish with his career, they come back at night, in the dull aches, in the exhaustion no trophy can soothe. His whole life taught him to be tough, to endure, to put duty above feeling, and he did it so well that sometimes no one remembers to ask if he's okay. The years of military service took his youth, the NFL seasons took his health, and his family had to learn to accept the absence of a man who was always there for duty, more than for himself. Yet what makes Staubach's story painful is not collapse, but the fact that he never allowed himself to collapse. In the silence of old age, he doesn't complain, doesn't grow bitter, doesn't seek pity. The will that kept him steady under Super Bowl pressure now helps him move through each day more slowly, more patiently, accepting that strength no longer lies in long throws, but in the ability to keep living with what was traded away. And right there, amid wordless pain and unshowy resolve, Roger Staubach emerges not just as a sports legend, but as a man who has walked his full path, carrying all the glory and all the wounds that glory left behind. If you cherish stories about glory, sacrifice, and the quiet price behind legends like Roger Staubach, please hit subscribe to join us on this continuing journey. Roger Staubach's childhood didn't open with loud tragedies or shocks that make people burst into tears, but with a prolonged kind of silence, the kind very familiar in classic mid-20th century American families, where love didn't need to be spoken and pain didn't need to be named. He grew up in an environment where values like discipline, responsibility, propriety, and self-control ranked higher than any show of emotion. It was a world where men were taught to stand straight, to endure, to keep walking even if something inside was cracking, because admitting pain was seen as weakness, and weakness wasn't allowed. No one asked the boy Roger what he was afraid of, how worried he felt, or if he needed a hug in moments of unease. Instead, he learned that the only way to survive was to stay quiet, fulfill his duties, and never become a burden to anyone. At family dinners, on school mornings, in the way adults spoke to each other, that message repeated invisibly: emotions are something you handle yourself, and best handled alone. School didn't help Roger escape that feeling, it only reinforced it. There, he was praised when he did well, corrected when he was wrong, but rarely asked how he felt. Achievement became the measure of worth, while inner life was pushed aside as unimportant. Roger learned to focus on what he could control: homework, sports practice, personal discipline, and ignore what he didn't know how to name. He wasn't taught how to face fear, so he learned to outrun it. He wasn't taught how to heal, so he learned to endure. It was in that context that football became a strange refuge. On the practice field, pain had rules, hits had purpose, and every fatigue was legitimized as part of growing up. When he fell, he was told to get up. When it hurt, he was taught to keep going. No one asked him to explain, and he didn't need to explain. That was the language Roger understood early, action instead of words, endurance instead of complaint, but that very adaptation, which once earned him praise as mature and reliable, quietly planted the seeds for long-term tragedy. Because every time Roger swallowed his fear, he also learned to disconnect from his real emotions. Every time he was praised for being strong, he understood that weakness wasn't allowed to exist. Gradually, that boy stopped seeking comfort because he didn't believe he needed it. He didn't learn to share because he wasn't taught that sharing was safe. What he learned very well was to carry everything alone. To many people, that's the foundation of a successful man. But for Roger Staubach, it was also the foundation of an inner life always kept tightly compressed. When he reached adulthood, when the burdens grew heavier and responsibilities greater, the boy from back then had no other tools left except silence. And that silence, honed from childhood, became habit, then instinct, then fate. Roger Staubach never learned to heal his early wounds because no one called them wounds. He only learned to keep living with them, carrying them as an inseparable part of who he was. The seed of tragedy wasn't in being mistreated, it was in being taught that he didn't need soothing. And when a person grows up believing pain is something to handle alone in silence, then for the rest of their life, even standing at the peak of fame, they will be used to enduring alone, no crying out in pain, no admitting fatigue, and never quite sure whether the right to be weak is really a right at all. When he left his childhood home to step into the Naval Academy, Roger Staubach didn't just change his living environment, he stepped straight into a world where emotion was seen as a luxury, even a danger. There, everything was measured by discipline, by the ability to obey orders, by how long you could stand firm under relentless pressure. No one cared where you came from, what you'd once feared, or what cracks you carried from childhood. The Naval Academy wasn't built to heal, it was built to forge, and in that process, the softest parts of a person were usually the first to be stripped away. The early days at the academy were a continuous chain of challenges, where the body was pushed to its limits and the mind forced to adapt or be left behind. Mornings started very early, commands rang out sharply, and every step, every stand at attention had to be precise. Mistakes weren't explained with feelings, they were recorded as deficiencies to correct. No one asked if you were tired, because fatigue was taken for granted. No one asked if you were scared, because fear had no place in a system designed to prepare men for war and sacrifice. The only question that repeated sometimes without being spoken aloud was, can you take it? And if the answer was no, the door was always there, open for those not strong enough to continue. Roger Staubach didn't walk out. He stayed, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was used to not admitting fear. The lessons here weren't just on the drill field or in the classroom, they seeped into how he saw himself. Every time he got through a grueling training session, every time he endured another night of exhaustion, he learned one more thing. Emotions can be suppressed, but duty cannot be escaped. Football at the Naval Academy carried a different meaning than anywhere else. On the field, he didn't just represent the team, he represented an entire value system, where failure wasn't just losing but damaging collective honor. There, pain was legitimized, fatigue was seen as duty, and silence became the common language. Roger played in that context, where every hit felt like part of mental training, teaching people how to keep going even when the body protested. The rare praise only reinforced the belief that a man's worth lay in endurance, not expression. The Naval Academy didn't teach him to listen to himself. It taught him to disregard himself for a greater goal. Gradually, that became his identity. Roger Staubach learned to control every expression on his face, every smallest gesture, because any sign of hesitation could be seen as lack of character. In the rare moments alone, unease probably still appeared, but he had no language to name it. He only knew he had to keep going, do better, be stronger than yesterday. And when he won the Heisman Trophy, when the whole country started calling his name as a new icon, the Naval Academy didn't celebrate the emotion. The Academy kept running as usual, reminding him that individual honors didn't change collective duty. That very coldness, harsh as it was, completed the character Roger had begun forming in childhood. A man who didn't seek comfort, didn't expect to be asked how he was, wasn't used to being allowed to stop. A man who learned to survive by enduring, who who saw carrying the load as natural and viewed complaint as unnecessary. The years at the Naval Academy didn't break him, but they taught him how to bend under pressure, to the point that later, when he stepped into the wider world, he carried a deep and dangerous belief that all pain can be overcome if you stay silent long enough. And that very belief, which once helped him stand firm through the biggest tests, also quietly prepared him for a life where prolonged endurance became the definition of strength, while being weak was never put on the table as an option. The Heisman Trophy came to Roger Staubach like a huge wave crashing in before he even fully understood where he stood in life. That year, the whole country was calling his name. Newspapers across the board ran pictures of the Naval Academy quarterback as the new symbol of poise, intelligence, and the future. It was the highest honor in college football, something thousands of players dream of their whole lives and never touch. To many, it was a moment of pure happiness, the door opening to a brilliant era. But for Roger Staubach, that glory arrived too early, and in a colder way than people imagined. Amid the thunderous applause echoing across the nation, he still had to return to the Naval Academy grounds, where everything kept running as if nothing had happened. No loosening up, no prolonged celebratory hugs, no one asking how it felt to have just stepped to the top. The Academy didn't change its rhythm for one individual, no matter how much the country was cheering that individual. Roger went back to the training schedule, the strict discipline, the mornings that started before the sun rose, as if the Heisman Trophy was just a decoration unrelated to the real him. It was in that contrast that the paradox began to show clearly. Roger Staubach became a widely known name, yet he had never felt so alone. The award didn't bring a sense of being reached. Instead, it created an invisible distance between him and the world around him. People looked at him as an icon, as a standard, as a model that had to be maintained, not as a young man still trying to figure out who he really was. The praise came from afar, through newspapers, through articles, through repeated words from people who'd never met him. But in daily life, no one sat down next to Roger to share that moment, to ask if he felt the pressure, if he was scared, if he felt he'd been put on a pedestal too soon. Glory didn't make the loneliness disappear, it only made the loneliness harder to speak about. Because when the whole country is praising you, admitting you feel lost sounds like ingratitude. Roger didn't allow himself to feel that way. He kept acting like an exemplary midshipman, a model athlete, a man living up to what society expected. But inside, a quiet disconnection was forming. The Heisman Trophy wasn't a door to emotional release. It was a reminder that from now on he had to live more carefully, more strongly, more perfectly. Any mistake would no longer be just a personal error. It would be a crack in the image others had built for him. The sad part is that Roger never got the chance to enjoy that moment like a normal young man. No time for innocent pride, no space for confusion, no one allowing him to say he wasn't ready. Glory came early, but maturity was forced early too. And in that process, the human part that needed to be touched, needed comfort, needed someone beside him, was gradually pushed further back. He was celebrated on the stage of honor, but when he stepped down, no arms were waiting, only the weight of continuing responsibility and expectations that kept rising. Roger Staubach learned one more lesson, no less painful than what he'd learned before, that success doesn't mean closeness, and being praised doesn't mean being understood. The Heisman Trophy, with all its shine, didn't soothe the loneliness that had followed him from childhood. It just draped a new layer over it, brighter but also colder. And right from that moment, the tragedy of a man celebrated but never truly touched began carving itself deeper into Roger Staubach's life, setting the stage for the years ahead, where he would keep living between the peak of respect and an ever-growing void in his inner world. Roger Staubach's NFL dream didn't shatter in one dramatic moment, wasn't stolen by injury or a harsh coaching decision. It was left hanging in a way that hurt far more, set aside by duty, by the call of the United States Navy, by a world where national obligation ranked higher than any personal ambition. When Roger left the Naval Academy with the Heisman Trophy in hand, the NFL was so close, teams knew him, experts mentioned him, and the future seemed already mapped out. But unlike other college players who could step straight onto the professional stage, Roger Staubach had to stop. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he had committed to serve. In an era when war was no longer an abstract idea but real bombs and bullets, the Navy called his name before the NFL could hand him a football. The dream wasn't denied, it was postponed indefinitely, and that waiting itself was what gnawed at him day after day. Roger put on the uniform, left the field, left the lights, left the rhythm of life he'd spent his youth preparing for. He went to Vietnam, a strange land where the familiar sounds weren't cheers anymore but helicopters, explosions and tension always hanging in the air. There, no one cared that he'd once been a Heisman Trophy winner, no one called him a future star. He was just a young officer, doing his job like everyone else, living in a reality where tomorrow was never guaranteed. On the rare quiet evenings, if there were any, they didn't bring peace. In the silence, Roger faced a fear he'd never learned to voice. When it all ended, would anyone still remember him as a player, or would the NFL dream die before it even started? There was no one to share that unease with. In the military, people didn't ask what you worried about for your personal future, they only asked if you'd completed the mission. Roger kept living exactly as he'd been taught from childhood, and sharpened at the Naval Academy, no complaining, no questioning, no showing weakness. But inside, time passed like a cruel reminder. Every NFL season went by without him. Every year of youth slipped away quietly, and those were years he could never get back. Other players started careers, gained experience, built names, while Roger stood outside, watching through the invisible gap between duty and desire. No one marked that sacrifice with applause. No headline wrote that a dream was being delayed for duty. His sacrifice happened in silence, without fanfare, without celebration, and therefore without comfort. In Vietnam, amid the war, Roger witnessed another reality of life, where loss was no longer abstract. The people around him weren't worried about missing a season, they worried about making it home. That alone kept him from allowing himself to complain. How could he talk about fearing for his career, when all around him were fears of losing life? He swallowed that feeling down, just as he'd swallowed every unease before. But the comparison didn't erase the pain, it only made the pain quieter. On long nights, Roger lay there, thinking about the field, about practices, about the feel of the ball in his hand, wondering if when he returned, the chance would still be waiting. The NFL didn't pause for anyone, and he understood that better than most. That understanding sharpened the fear. No one told him everything would be okay. No one guaranteed age wouldn't be a barrier. No one promised these years of sacrifice would be repaid. Roger Staubach kept doing the only thing he knew, endure and fulfill his duty. His youth passed in waiting, not the romantic hopeful kind, but a tense waiting, where every passing day was both one day closer to the dream, and one day the dream might vanish. The tragedy of this period wasn't in the bombs, it was in the suspension. No victory, no defeat, just being hung between two worlds. One side the man he had to become for duty, the other the man he hadn't yet become for his dream. No one knew that throughout that time, Roger Staubach's greatest fear wasn't the war, it was the prospect of coming back and finding the NFL door had closed, while he had no right to step through. And that silent fear, kept locked away through all those military years, carved one more layer of tragedy into his life, the tragedy of a man who sacrificed the right way, but had to live with the unspoken question of whether that sacrifice had caused his dream to die young before it could even breathe. When Roger Staubach finally returned to the NFL, it wasn't the triumphant full-circle moment people usually tell in sports stories. It was a tense homecoming where every step carried the fear of being a beat behind time. He was 27 years old, a number that sounds harmless in everyday life, but in the world of professional football, it was the fragile line between potential and too late. Other players at that age had already had a few seasons to make mistakes, to learn, to adjust, while Roger stepped into the NFL like someone arriving late, carrying the old glow of the Heisman Trophy, but no longer the privilege of youth. No one was waiting for him. No one said he had time. The Dallas Cowboys looked at him with cautious respect, but also with an unspoken question: was this man still fresh enough to be the future, or just a beautiful memory arriving too late? Roger felt it clearly in every practice, in every evaluating glance, In every moment he had to do better just to be considered equal. He wasn't allowed to make the mistakes young rookies could. A missed throw wasn't just a technical error, it was a reminder that age was working against him. Every practice felt like a final exam, every game like a chance that might never come again. That pressure wasn't loud. No one yelled that he was old, but it was there in the urgency of every decision. Roger understood that the NFL had no concept of patience for late arrivals, no getting acquainted phase, no time for the body and mind to slowly adapt. He had to prove double to be recognized half. The years in the Navy had forged his discipline, but they'd also left a hard-to-fill gap, real NFL experience. While other quarterbacks were used to the pace, the speed, the particular violence of the league, Roger had to learn it all under a microscope. Every game carried the feeling that if he didn't do enough today, tomorrow his name might not be in the long-term plans. That fear didn't stop him, but it made every moment heavier. Roger played with the awareness that he had no right to waste any opportunity, because opportunity was the rarest thing for someone returning at 27. The hits on the field didn't just test his body, they reminded him that his body no longer recovered like a 22-year-old's. Every time he got up after a tackle, he didn't just feel pain, he wondered how much longer he could take it, but he didn't let those thoughts linger too long. He kept doing what he'd learned his whole life, endure and move forward. In the locker room he didn't complain. On the practice field he didn't whine. He knew any sign of hesitation could be read as lack of readiness. And so Roger Staubach entered the NFL carrying a psychological burden few noticed. He had to play as if every game was the last, while still keeping the calm of a leader. That pressure forged him in a brutal way. It forced absolute focus, faster reading of the game, sharper decisions, because there was no room for prolonged mistakes. But at the same time, it took away the lightness others had in their early career years. Roger wasn't allowed to enjoy being here. He was only allowed to prove he deserved to stay. In silence he carried the worry that just one injury, one bad stretch, and it could all end before it really began. Every game was an unforgiving test, where he faced not only the opposing defense but also time slipping away faster than for anyone else. The psychological drama of this period wasn't in the scoreboard. It was in the feeling of always standing on the edge, where one slip meant falling. Roger Staubach didn't enter the NFL as someone awaited, he entered as someone with no way back. And that made every game, every play, every moment on the field carry the weight of a last chance, a gamble he couldn't lose if he wanted the dream not to end in the same silence as the years he'd waited in Vietnam. When Roger Staubach truly established himself in the Dallas Cowboys uniform, people started calling him the leader, the soul, the man who could keep the entire team standing tall under the brutal pressure of the NFL. But very few understood that behind that leadership role was a profound loneliness, hidden behind discipline and silence. The Dallas Cowboys of those years weren't just a team, they were a national symbol, America's team, where every game carried the expectations of millions. And at the center of it all, Roger Staubach stood there, not just as a quarterback, but as the one shouldering the spiritual responsibility for the whole collective. He didn't just have to read the opposing defense, he had to read the mood of his teammates, know when to stay calm, when to be firm, when to take on the pressure so others could breathe. Leadership in Dallas didn't allow weakness. A wavering look, a moment of hesitation, could spread through the whole team like a crack. Roger understood that better than anyone, so he chose to keep everything inside. He didn't share his fears, didn't talk about the pressure of age, didn't mention the accumulating pain after every game. On the field, he always stood tall, voice decisive, eyes steady. In the locker room, he was the mental anchor, the one everyone looked to know if things were still under control. But that very role made him more and more isolated. Leadership means being the last one to fall, and ideally, never falling in front of others. Roger Staubach became the shield for the group, taking the criticism, the doubts, the failures so his teammates didn't have to carry them. Every loss was an invisible cut, not just to the standings, but to the faith he felt he had to protect. He didn't allow himself to complain, because he knew if the leader complained, the whole mental structure would shake. But prolonged silence has its own price. No one asked how exhausted he was, because the image he'd built was too solid for others to think he needed to be asked. No one thought that the man who always stood straight also had restless nights, moments of wondering how much longer he could keep carrying it all. In his leadership role, Roger learned to sacrifice even his own personal space. The joy of victory was rarely fully enjoyed, because right after came worry about the next game. The sadness of defeat wasn't allowed to show, because the team needed a guide, not someone sharing suffering. Leadership in loneliness became a familiar state. He stood among thousands, but had nowhere to set down his burden, and that is the quiet tragedy of the leadership role. You're trusted, you're respected, but rarely truly understood. Roger Staubach didn't fall, not because he wasn't tired, but because he didn't allow himself to be tired. He kept playing, kept leading, kept holding the Dallas Cowboys steady in the harshest moments. But every step forward took away a piece of energy that was never replenished. For him, leadership wasn't shared glory, it was responsibility endured alone. And in that silence, he perfected the image of a leader who wasn't allowed to fall, while at the same time losing the right to lean on anyone when he needed it most. The Super Bowl elevated Roger Staubach to the peak every quarterback dreams of, but it was also from there that his physical tragedy began in a way no trophy could reflect. The 2 Super Bowl championships came to the Dallas Cowboys as the final affirmation that the man once seen as too late had beaten time, beaten doubt, beaten even the years left hanging by duty. On the scoreboard, they were historic wins. On television, they were images of a calm, precise, ice-cold leader in decisive moments. But behind the lights and fireworks, each Super Bowl was also a silent devastation on his body. The hits at the highest level of the NFL were unlike anything Roger had experienced before. Defenses rushed him with unforgiving speed and power, and every time he went down was another jolt to the nervous system, another moment of dizziness, another reminder from his body that it was being pushed beyond limits. Concussions back then weren't properly named, weren't properly understood, and certainly weren't spoken about. Roger got up, adjusted his helmet, kept playing, because the game wasn't over, and the team needed him. Pain had no place in headlines. The big print was only about strategy, about poise, about decisive moments. No one wrote about the lingering headaches, the post-game dizziness, the nights when even the living room light was enough to make his head throb. Victory covered everything. When you win a Super Bowl, you're not allowed to say you're hurting. When you're the hero, admitting injury sounds like breaking the story everyone wants to believe. Roger Staubach understood that, and chose silence. He kept leading the team, kept shouldering the pressure, kept putting his body into collisions that each left a mark. Each championship was a historic milestone, but also another layer of damage piled on what had already accumulated. His body became a second battlefield, no spectators, no cheers, just repeated endurance. The most painful part was that those pains were never properly acknowledged. They didn't show up in stats, weren't awarded trophies, weren't etched in names. They existed in silence, in the way he rubbed his temples after games, in the fatigue that lingered for days. Roger didn't play to be pitied. He played out of duty, for the team, out of the belief that leadership meant staying upright, no matter how high the price grew. The Super Bowl brought immortal glory, but it also started a chain of consequences that only years later, when the lights went out, people gradually began to recognize. Roger Staubach's physical tragedy didn't happen in one tragic moment, it happened in hundreds of victorious moments, where every hit was cheered, every fall seen as noble sacrifice. And right in those moments, the pain was hidden behind victory, quietly accumulating, preparing for a later chapter, where titles could no longer shield a body that had given too much in exchange for glory. Roger Staubach's family never appeared in the papers as a loud tragedy. No betrayal, no bitter divorce, no sensational headlines for people to gossip about. On the surface, it was the model family America knew and admired, enduring, discreet, proper. But right in that propriety, a quiet absence existed, not shattering, but never quite complete. Roger loved his family the way he'd learned his whole life, through responsibility, through sacrifice, through always trying to do the right thing. But what he rarely could give them was full presence. The peak years with the Dallas Cowboys swallowed his time. Training schedules, constant travel, long strategy meetings, and the pressure to always be ready kept him frequently absent from the everyday moments his family needed most. He didn't leave, didn't avoid, he just arrived late. Late for dinners that had gone cold, late for milestones that had passed, late for moments where a father's or husband's presence couldn't be replaced by any apology. Roger Staubach never stopped loving, but he also never had enough time to love in a gentle way. His family learned to wait for him as part of their rhythm, wait for him to come back after the season, wait for him to be free after a grueling stretch of games, wait for him to step out of the leader role and back into being an ordinary man. That waiting didn't cause a breakdown, but it left gaps. And those gaps weren't always filled by honor or success. There were moments Roger realized he'd missed things that couldn't come back. The quiet growing up of his children, small stories no longer told, emotions that passed the point when they needed to be shared. He didn't do anything wrong, but he also didn't always do enough. The Staubach-style tragedy lies there, no clear mistake to regret, just prolonged absence that leaves pain with no one to blame. His family understood, but understanding doesn't mean not feeling the lack. And Roger understood it too, but back in those years he had no other way. Leading a team, carrying the expectations of millions, meant his family had to share him with the whole world. When his career hit its peak, the family didn't collapse, but they also weren't put first the way they should have been. Roger loved deeply enough not to betray, but he also loved within the framework of a man used to putting duty before emotion. Only when he had more time, when the stadium lights gradually dimmed, did he realize presence is something you can't make up for with memories. He came home more, listened more, but inside there was always the feeling he was a beat behind. The Staubach family didn't break, but the gaps time left didn't disappear. They lingered as a quiet reminder that love doesn't just need loyalty, it needs the right timing. And for Roger Staubach, the greatest pain wasn't loving wrong, it was loving the right people the right way, but in a life where duty always made him arrive later than his heart wanted. Roger Staubach's decision to walk away didn't come from a bitter loss, wasn't forced by declining performance or public doubts. It came from a very different, very human, and very hard to say fear in the world of heroes. Fear of his children forgetting his face, fear of not having enough strength left to be present, fear that one day he'd become a burden to the very people he loved most. After the peak years, after the Super Bowls, after seasons where every game wore away another piece of his body, Roger began to feel more clearly the limits he'd once deliberately ignored. The pain no longer faded after a few days off. The exhaustion was no longer fleeting. Mornings waking up took longer to stand straight, longer for his mind to return to normal rhythm. But what made him waver wasn't his own pain, it was the increasingly clear image of his family in his mind. He watched his children grow in fragmented moments, short evenings, rare weekends not fully claimed by the schedule. And one day, the fear slipped in very quietly: if he kept going, would he become a father remembered only through newspaper photos and game footage, rather than through his children's living memories? Roger Staubach never ran from responsibility his whole life, but this time, responsibility pulled him in two opposite directions. One side was the team, his teammates, the leadership role he'd carried for so many years. The other was his family, moments that couldn't be postponed, couldn't be replayed. He understood that if he kept playing, the price wasn't just his body, it was the final years of his children's childhood. And the fear of becoming a burden was there too. He'd seen players cling on too long, only to leave the field quietly, with battered bodies and eroded memories. Roger didn't want his children to remember him as a father in pain, irritable, or always absent, because he was trying to hold on to a past prime. The retirement decision came in silence, no grand ceremony, no promises of return. When he walked off the field for the last time, there was no thunderous applause for that moment. The crowd still loved him, but they loved the image on the grass more than the moment a man walked away. In the sports world, people celebrate beginnings and peaks, endings are often overlooked. Roger Staubach accepted that. He didn't seek pity, didn't need praise for his decision, but inside, it was an unprepared goodbye. He could still play, he could still lead, but he chose to stop before his body and his memories forced him to stop. The greatest tragedy lies right there, walking away while he still had the ability, while his heart still loved the field, only because he understood that there are things more important that if missed, could never be regained. When the stadium lights went out, Roger returned home with an emptiness that was hard to name. No more training schedules, no more opening whistles, no more familiar leadership role. He faced a silence he had rarely known in his entire life, and in that silence, there was no farewell applause, no perfect closing ceremony, just a man wondering if he had done the right thing, if this quiet sacrifice would be understood. But then, in the quiet evenings with his family, when he saw the look in his children's eyes, Roger Staubach understood that some decisions don't need the crowd's approval, some departures receive no applause, but they are the most courageous acts a man can make. And though the regret remained, he accepted carrying it, just as he had carried every other pain in his life, because this time, that endurance bought what he feared losing most, being there fully, in the memories of the people he loved. Post-NFL came to Roger Staubach, not in decline or lost direction, but in a paradox even harder to face: success, stability, admiration, but emptiness. He stepped off the field, with the discipline of a naval officer and the mindset of a leader, quickly building a business career that earned widespread respect. Real estate deals, shrewd investments, meetings where his voice was heard, all proved that Roger Staubach didn't need football to keep winning. He built a new empire with the same precision and responsibility he once used to command a huddle amid roaring stands. But even as the numbers grew, even as his business reputation spread, there was an emptiness no financial report could fill. The field wasn't just where he worked, it was where his identity was formed. And when it vanished, that part of his identity left too, leaving a silence hard to name. Roger worked hard, stayed busy, stayed effective, but without the life-or-death urgency of those old Sundays. No more moments where the whole world held its breath, waiting for his decision. No more heart-pounding before kickoff. Business brought intellectual satisfaction, but it couldn't replace the raw emotion of the field. New success didn't heal old memories. On quiet nights, when work was done, memories returned uninvited, throws into cold wind, hits that rattled helmets, moments leading teammates back from the brink. Roger didn't regret leaving, but he couldn't deny the longing. It wasn't a longing he was allowed to voice, because he had done well after retirement, had proven he was fine. But inside, the absence persisted. He was no longer called on Sunday afternoons, no longer responsible for a collective looking to him. And for someone who had lived his whole life in a leadership role, the absence of responsibility could itself become a kind of loss. Roger Staubach kept doing what he did best, moving forward, building, not looking back too long. But some things can't be replaced by new achievements. Business didn't bring the smell of wet grass, the slap of teammates' hands, the feeling of sharing victory or defeat. Those memories didn't need healing, but they couldn't be erased. They existed as part of him, both a source of pride and a reminder that some phases of life can't be recreated. Roger Staubach's post-NFL carried its own very particular sadness, not collapse, but continuation, missing what once made his heart beat strongest. He succeeded, but he understood clearly that some victories can only happen once in a lifetime, and when they're gone, no matter how full the rest becomes, it can't replace the feeling of standing on the field, carrying an entire team on his shoulders, and knowing in that moment he was living most fully as his true self. Old age came to Roger Staubach quietly, undramatically, through a slow and ruthless series of biological reminders that the body never forgets what it has endured. The hits once cheered with roars now returned, as lingering dull aches, joints stiffening every morning, headaches arriving suddenly like delayed echoes from the past. Roger was used to pain with rules, pain after the game, pain then recovery, pain then keep going. But in old age the pain didn't leave, it stayed, quiet but persistent, as if his body were slowly rereading every page of the ledger he had written, with his own flesh. There were days he woke up and took longer to recognize his own familiar rhythm, not because he forgot, but because memory began to blur on the small details. A name slower than usual to surface, a memory needing a few extra seconds to piece together. Those moments no one saw, no one recorded, but for Roger, they were enough to plant a new unease in his heart. He had once faced the world's strongest defenses without flinching, but now his opponent was the fragility of his own mind. Sleepless nights became familiar, not just from physical aches, but from quiet thoughts that refused to let go. In the darkness, when everything was still, the question came clearer than ever: will I still remember who I am tomorrow? It wasn't fear of death, it was fear of losing himself bit by bit while still alive. Roger had watched many former teammates struggle with the aftermath of those playing years, strong men who later became lost in their own memories. He understood that every old concussion didn't disappear, it just waited for its moment to return. And that understanding made old age not a time of complete rest, but a time of vigilance. He listened to his body more slowly, more carefully, but he couldn't fully dispel the quiet worry. There were mornings he wondered if he could still hold the image of the man the country once admired, or if the day would come when he was only a name others recalled, while he no longer recognized it. Roger Staubach's biological tragedy wasn't in sudden collapse, it was in the prolonged wearing away, where every passing day demanded he adapt to a weaker version of himself. He didn't complain, didn't display the fear, because his whole life had taught him endurance was the only way to keep going. But even the most accustomed to endurance can't stay completely calm in the face of losing memory, losing identity, losing control. In his lucid moments, Roger reminded himself he was still here, still remembered the path he'd walked, still recognized the values that had guided him his whole life. But fear doesn't need reason to exist. It only needs one unsteady moment, one fleeting forgetfulness, to remind him that the final victory isn't on the field, it's in the silent fight to hold on to himself. And in old age, Roger Staubach walked more slowly, thought more deeply, carrying all the beautiful memories and the wounds, hoping that tomorrow, when he woke, he would still be clear enough to know who he had been, and who he still was in the remaining part of his life. Honor continued to come to Roger Staubach even long after he left the field. Formal ceremonies, speeches of tribute, medals and praise recounting a life America proudly called the standard. His name was spoken with absolute respect. Hall of Fame, leadership icon, moral example, the man who did everything the right way. Each time the crowd rose to applaud, lights shone, and history was retold in solemn tones. But when the ceremony ended, when the seats emptied and the room grew quiet again, the pains remained undiminished. Medals didn't ease stiff knees in the morning. Tributes didn't soothe sudden headaches. Honor couldn't sharpen memory on weary days. That paradox gradually became clear. Society can honor a man with the brightest symbols, but the body doesn't care about symbols. It only remembers the hits, the falls, the moments pushed beyond limits. Roger Staubach sat listening to people speak of his greatness with the calm he had honed his whole life. He smiled, nodded, said thank you, because he knew the words were sincere. But deep inside, he also understood a hard truth: no title could give back what was lost. No medal was awarded for sleepless nights. No ceremony honored quiet endurance. The most painful things usually have no audience. Roger didn't resent the system that honored him. He didn't deny the value of honor. But he realized that honor belongs to collective memory, while pain belongs to the individual. Those two worlds exist side by side, and rarely touch. When people called him a legend, they saw a seamless line of success. When he looked back, he saw a long chain of trade-offs, where every glory came with a piece of erosion. What made this paradox bitter wasn't lack of recognition, it was the powerlessness of recognition against biological reality. The body doesn't know about tributes, it only responds to time. And time, no matter how covered in honor, keeps taking bit by bit. Roger Staubach accepted it with the same attitude he had accepted every challenge before: no complaining, no blaming. But in that acceptance, there was a very real sadness. Because if honor doesn't heal the pain, then ultimately, where does its value lie in a person's individual life? Perhaps it lies in meaning for others, for the next generation, for those who look to him to believe discipline and integrity still have a place. For Roger himself, honor was something he cherished with his mind, while pain was something he lived with in his body every day. And that very distance created a quiet tragedy, a man endlessly honored, yet still facing limits no one else could carry for him. At 83, Roger Staubach lives in a very strange state, relieved because there's nothing left to prove, yet weighed down because he now fully understands the true cost of everything he once did. No more field to return to, no more standings to climb, no more lights scrutinizing every decision. The questions that haunted him his whole life, am I good enough, strong enough, worthy enough, have finally gone quiet. He answered them with an entire lifetime, and in that very silence, a settled sadness emerges, not sharp, not explosive, but persistent and deeply felt. Roger has no regrets. He doesn't wish he had chosen a different path, doesn't torment himself over the decisions he made. He understands that if he could go back, with the same values, the same discipline, the same belief in duty, he would still walk the same way. But understanding doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. At this age, he looks back on the years gone by with a clarity youth never allowed. He sees more clearly the mornings that won't return, the seasons that passed too quickly, the family moments missed because of duty. Those things no longer torment him with regret, they torment him with awareness. The price of greatness wasn't paid only in sweat and honor, but in time, the one thing that can never be given back. Roger Staubach no longer needs anyone's further validation. The titles are enough, the story has been told, history has recorded it. But when there's nothing left to prove, a man is forced to face himself without the lens of achievement. He faces a slower body, a memory that sometimes skips a beat, long silences throughout the day. And in those silences, he doesn't try to fill them with busyness or noise. He accepts that the most beautiful years have passed, that not every sacrifice can be measured by results, that integrity sometimes demands losses that can't be named. The tragedy at 83 is no longer fierce pain, it's belated understanding. He understands he lived a righteous life, but righteous doesn't mean gentle. He understands he did everything expected of him, but doing so also took away his right to slow down sooner, to be with his family more, to listen to his body earlier. Those years can't be reclaimed, can't be repaired. They can only be looked back on with the calm of someone who has reached the end of the road. Roger Staubach doesn't sit there lamenting, he sits there understanding that life isn't measured by the number of trophies, but by the total amount of time we traded away. And when there's nothing left to prove, the only thing remaining is the stark truth. He lived fully by the values he believed in, and accepted that this very fullness wore him down little by little. The quiet tragedy of old age lies there, not in physical pain or forgetfulness, but in the very human realization that the most beautiful parts of his life were spent entirely on duty, and now only memories remain to remind him they once existed. When the story closes, Roger Staubach isn't standing on the field, isn't on a podium of honor, isn't at the center of any tribute ceremony. He's in a very ordinary moment of old age, where there's no cheering to drown out the thoughts, no grand responsibilities to postpone facing himself. There, his tragedy appears most clearly, not as a collapse, but as a lifelong wearing away. Roger Staubach isn't a man broken by mistakes. He wasn't destroyed by scandal, betrayal, or wrong choices. On the contrary, his tragedy lies in doing the right thing for too long, too persistently, and too thoroughly. From a childhood where he learned not to cry out in pain, to the Naval Academy, where emotion was seen as weakness, to the war years that postponed his dream, to the NFL where every game was a test of survival, Roger Staubach never once chose the easier path for himself. He chose the right path, right in discipline, right in honor, right in duty, and accepted every consequence of that choice without demanding compensation. People looking at his life often see a beautiful straight line of success: Heisman Trophy, Super Bowls, Hall of Fame, enduring family, solid post-NFL career. But that straight line was drawn with constant endurance, with pushing himself aside to prioritize duty, with never allowing himself to stop even when body and mind sent the faintest cries for help. Roger Staubach didn't break, he wore down, worn by impacts, worn by pressure, worn by years of being the most reliable person in the room, the one who couldn't hesitate, the one who couldn't be weak. And precisely because he never allowed himself to collapse, no one noticed he was slowly running out. His tragedy has no dramatic climax. It happened quietly, day by day, season by season, right decision stacked on right decision, until their total became a biological and spiritual burden no title could remove. At 83, when all the external questions have been answered, only the internal ones remain, ones no one else can answer for him. He has no regrets, but he understands that some things have been used up and can't be recreated. Intact health, full presence in every stage of his family's life, the likeness of a man allowed to put himself before duty. Roger Staubach lived as an icon America respects, but he also lived as a human who sacrificed his right to be weak in order to keep that icon from cracking, and that makes his tragedy deeper than any public failure. There's no one to blame, no wrong decision to fix, just a very human truth. Doing the right thing for too long can wear a man down. Some men are not broken, they are simply worn down by doing the right thing for too long. Roger Staubach is living proof of that saying. He didn't collapse, but he paid in full. Paid with youth postponed, with a body carrying the memory of every hit, with years his family had to wait, with an old age that had to learn to live with irreversible wearing away. And if there's one deepest legacy this story leaves for Americans, it's not just a lesson about victory or honor, it's a quiet reminder of the price of doing right, that society needs men like Roger Staubach to stand firm, but also needs to learn to ask them a very simple question they've rarely heard in their lives: are you okay? Because sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't being defeated, it's enduring so well that no one realizes a man reached his limit a very long time ago. The story of Roger Staubach leaves a very characteristic quiet sadness of America, a sadness not born from failure, but from a man who lived too rightly within a value system that didn't allow him to be weak. From a childhood where he learned not to cry out in pain, to the Naval Academy, an environment that only asked, "Can you take it?" to the Heisman Trophy that came too early but brought no real human touch, everything shaped a Staubach who was disciplined, silent, and always put duty before feeling. When his NFL dream was left hanging because of naval duty and the Vietnam War, his youth passed in waiting and silent fear that his career might die before it began. Returning to the NFL at 27, he had to play as if every game was his last chance, then became the absolute solitary leader of the Dallas Cowboys, carrying the whole team without being allowed to fall. 2 Super Bowl championships brought glory, but also opened the door to physical tragedy with hits and concussions that never made headlines. His family didn't break, but was always missing something, because he loved deeply but often arrived late. His retirement decision, not from failure but from fear of his children forgetting his face, was the most painful moment, one without farewell applause. Post-NFL, business success couldn't replace the field. Old age, his body remembers every hit. Honor couldn't heal the pain. The lesson for Americans lies here. Society glorifies discipline, responsibility and endurance, but needs to learn to protect the human being behind the icon. Doing the right thing is noble, but if prolonged too long without space for healing, it wears you down. Roger Staubach reminds us that true strength isn't just enduring, it's also daring to admit limits, daring to ask each other a seemingly simple question: are you okay? Thank you for staying until the very end to listen with us to the quiet but deeply dignified story of Roger Staubach. If you cherish the values of responsibility, sacrifice and the silent price behind glory, please hit subscribe to the channel to join us on this journey. See you in the next video, where we'll continue telling stories not just about legends, but about the real human beings behind the spotlight.